Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar on the 2021 budget. I am your host, Ralph Rivas. Now, the budget for next year, sinasabi ng ilan, is definitely the budget to watch. It will, in theory, address the pandemic's impact, the lingering impact, our country's gross domestic product, and our lots of businesses have been closed. It's very problematic. And the 2021 budget is, of course, President Rodrigo Duterte's last full year budget. It's very politically charged, lots of issues that we need to discuss kung popondohan ba talaga ni Duterte yung mga proyekto na kailangan natin ngayon or saan ba talaga. Now, to help us make sense of the priorities of the Duterte administration for next year, we have lots of speakers. We'll try to accommodate as many questions as we can. For now, the first presenter will be Robert Sanders Jr. He is a policy research associate of iLead. iLead, of course, has a primary focus on economic development and public policy. Well, Robert here has worked on several projects with local and international development organizations and serves as a consultant for key policymakers. Robert, hi, Robert.
Hi, hello, good afternoon. I'll start sharing now, no? Okay. Hello, hi everyone. It's been a while since we're online talking about the budget. But I think it comes at just about the right time because we're at crunch time really for budget. But before we get into the 2021 proposed budget, let's go through just some figures. Just to set the lay of the land. No, the Philippine economy has tanked. That much is true for the second quarter of GDP when the lockdowns were affected, and also for the third quarter. This was released recently, just this October. GDP shrank by 11.5% further. This is double digits, quite low, well, much lower than what people were expecting. Some economists were beginning to feel optimistic about the lifting of quarantine restrictions because people will be able to go out, businesses will be able to open up again. They were expecting the economy to contract, but only at about the low single digits. But as we see here, quarter three, it's still at 11.5%. So that puts into question the prospect of recovering in time for the end of the year or priming our rebound for the following year. Philippines has been very slow to get out of this hole that we find ourselves in. We're that red line here in the among our neighbors. Vietnam was able to grow in the middle of the pandemic at 0.4%. Quarter three grew even more at 2.6%. And then we see Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, all of our neighbors doing better than us. Now, to be fair, our trajectory is upwards, but it's just that we're in a deeper hole compared to them. Firms, 70.6% of them have temporarily closed as a result of the pandemic. You see from this report from the ADB, a lot of effects, a lot of experiences from a lot of negative effects that were experienced by our firms. So disruption of production supply chains, 34.2% of firms experienced that in the Philippines, 19.1% experienced cancellations of contracts, et cetera, et cetera. The economic progress for the past 5 years wiped out because of COVID pandemic and the subsequent response. So from 2015 to 2020, we grew this much, and then just in a snap of a finger, back to how it was 5 years ago. Jobs also severely affected. Around April, when the ECQ was at its height, 17.7% of people found themselves unemployed. Improved later on when the restrictions eased up at 10%. But as you can see here, it's still above and beyond what used to be the unemployment rate. 200,000 plus of OFWs, OFWs were repatriated since. 600,000 have asked for assistance. And this is quite worrying because before we've relied heavily on remittances from OFWs to bail us out from any economic crisis. But the problem with the pandemic is that the scale is global. There's no safe harbor. Everyone is affected. And they find that they themselves need bailing out now. Um, Hunger has been on the rise. Latest survey from SWS shows that 30.7% of the respondents experienced hunger during that period. So 22% experienced hunger only once or a few times, and then 8.7% experienced hunger often or were always hungry. Um, a lot of optimists, pessimists really. 82% of those surveyed felt that their lives were worse off in the past 12 months. And then only 6% felt that they were better off. The budget deficit is climbing. On the fiscal side of the government, this means that government has been spending more than what it has been earning. And to finance that deficit, growth has also been picking up. But the upside to this is that public debt has become more manageable. Sometimes we're so used to being alarmed by these figures, by deficit climbing, by debt climbing. Um, but if you look at the past years, public debt has actually been quite manageable. And what does that say? It says that money should not be a problem. We should not be scrimping on aid. We should not be so conservative fiscally when people need to be spent on. So DOF loans, 480 billion as of October 2. Treasury borrowings were at 85% of program. That means there's still around 400 billion of money that we can still borrow that conforms with the planned borrowing. And then BSP repo agreements, 200 billion were issued in March. I think these were paid off in September. And then 540 billion again in October. So money is not a problem. Why is it important? Well, because there's a global consensus that the government should play a central role in pandemic response. That solving the health problem also solves the economic problem. For a while, I've been very uncomfortable with this narrative that's being pushed that it's either we stick to the lockdowns and that solves the health problem, or we compromise the health response and start opening up the economy again. Vietnam has demonstrated that that simply is not true. There's really no dichotomy there. Once you solve the health problem, the economic problem follows. And a lot of that is because of consumer confidence. When the health problem, the pandemic, has scared a lot of people, and that caused them to freeze on their spending. If you're not so sure if you'll have a job next year, next month, you won't really spend the money you have. You won't really invest or expand. But when the threat ceases to exist, where the threat ceases to become a threat, the health problem isn't a problem anymore, then that freeze on confidence dissipates. As we saw before, people can spend from home. From the 11, 11, 10, 10, 9, 9 promos, people can spend from home, but the problem really isn't about mobility restrictions or lockdowns. It's about people's confidence to spend the money that they have, and that's key in moving the economy again. We talk about that because when we look at how the government has been spending so far, there's cause for worry. Now, for quarter 3, for example, smack in the middle of the pandemic, we saw government spending to be actually lower than that of last year. So cumulative spending for quarter 3, 2020, that's this, totaled to about 1.009 trillion. And that is about 27 billion lower than quarter 3, 2019. So imagine in a time of pandemic, in a time of emergency disaster, we expect that the government actually spend more because there is greater need, heightened need from the populace now. So this again invites questions as to whether our public institutions are being pushed hard enough to deliver on the services that are needed to be delivered, especially in times of emergency. So as we saw this month, it's not really just the COVID pandemic that we're dealing with. Successive typhoons have battered the country, and it really, again, poses the question, can the government keep up? Can it give aid to those who need it? Also, latest infra expenditures, 16.5% lower than 2019 figures, but 4.8% higher than 2020 program spending. So in 2019, by quarter 3 last year, 540.7 billion was spent on infrastructure. This year, only 451.5 billion, right? So you think that's kind of understandable because there were some budget cuts in the Bayanihan laws, right? Some funds were taken from infrastructure, redirected to labor, social protection, et cetera, et cetera. But also it casts into doubt the government's strategy, right? They say bill is the key to getting ourselves out of this economic problem. But it seems like, well, it can't really build fast enough if it's 16.5% lower than it was last year. So we arrive at the changes in the proposed 2021 budget. We think this is very important because it shows how the two branches of government view budget, or like what the people need. So the NEP, National Expenditure Program, that's submitted by the executive. So bureaucrats, those who run the agencies, that's what they submit. And then the GAB is what the congressmen make out of the NEP. So they deliberate amongst themselves. Just this month, the House of Representatives passed their version of GAB. I think last night, the senators were in for a late evening trying to work on the GAB also. They're working on amendments as we speak. I think so. After that, they pass their own version. They meet for bicameral conference committee and hash out. So it's an opportune time. It's crunch time when talking about budget because this is the time where if uh, parang it's now or never if we're going to speak up about priorities. So again, this is the universe that we're working with for 2021, 4.5 trillion. This is the highest it's ever been. For the NEP, this is the executive version. These were their pillars. Reset, rebound, and recover. Reset as in respond to the pandemic. Rebound as in revive infrastructure development. And recover as in adapt to post-pandemic life. So quite interestingly, you see here that even when you add reset and recover, our rebound is still higher, right? So infrastructure is still the main pillar for your, for economic development of the administration. So in reset, you see the National Health Insurance Program, that's PhilHealth, 71.4 billion, subsidy assistance to indigent patients, 17.3 billion, epidemiology and surveillance, just 500 million, human resources for health, 16.6 billion, et cetera, et cetera. And then 666.5 billion for public works, and then 67 billion for food security, 22 for industry livelihood, 149 for social protection, 191 for education, etc., etc. But these are the things that we need to point out immediately in the NEP version. DOH funds were cut by 27% compared to what they were with the GAA plus Bayanihan 1 and 2. And then marginal increases in specific programs. Then of the new items that respond directly to COVID, only 2.7 billion for procurement of PPEs, 1 billion for testing kits, 2.5 billion for vaccine. While for rebound and recover, no more SAP, small changes in the SWD aid programs, less assistance for affected workers and MSMEs, inadequate funds for social services, then DepEd also insufficient to support distance learning, but big top-ups for security and military. So salaries, operations, counterinsurgency, illegal drugs, even pension and gratuity. Moving to the GAP version, right? It's really more on the same. It still focuses on infrastructure development. Granted, they cut 20 billion from transportation, and then they distributed that to other parts of the budget. So additional 5.5 billion in family health, immunization, nutrition, and responsible parenting. We're not sure if this is directly for COVID vaccines, but since it's under an item that has immunization, we presume it's additional funds for COVID. And then, but no additional money for procurement of PPEs and testing kits. Additional 1.7 billion for food security, additional 4 billion for jobs and livelihood assistance, additional 2 billion for social protection, but that's it. Most of the observations still hold. They're still the same for the GAP. When you look at, you see that most visually here. This is top 10 departments comparing 2020 total APRO, 2020 NEP, and 2021 GAP. The white line, that is GAA plus Bayanihan 1 and 2. Bright green line, that is NEP. Bright blue line, that's GAP. Just a stark illustration of how they're really not much change. They're almost the same level, save for a few increases, decreases here and there. So quite illustrative. We go to DOH, for example. It decreased from 181 billion to 128 billion in the NEP, but increased by 5.5 billion in the GAB. So 101.02 billion in GAA plus Bayanihan 1 and 2, down to 127.77. And then in the GAB, it increased by 5.5. Here in family health, immunization, nutrition, responsible parenting. Aside from that, nothing changed from NEP to the GAB. Even PhilHealth subsidies, nothing changed from NEP to the GAB. So this is something to watch out for, because aside from there being the pandemic in 2021, I think it's quite implicit and palpable that COVID 2021 will still be a COVID year. It again invites questions as to the preparedness of the DOH or the government in general to implement universal health care. Nothing like this year has showed us that health insurance and healthcare is quite important, especially for the poorest of the poor. Infrastructure to lead economic rebound, according to government. There's a 51% increase in DPWH budget in the NEP, but no change in the GAB. So DPWH infra took some hits in Bayanihan 1, and then it seems like the government is intent on catching up, right? But the main observation that we saw from NEP to GAB is this: some APRO, some budget that were initially in asset preservation, network development, bridge program, and flood management. Some of them are moved to local program and convergence and special support programs, right? Major funding reallocations in the GAB because the local program increased by 33%, and the convergence and special support program increased by almost 1/4 of its size. It's important first because from NEP to GAB, it seems like the centralization problem that Luis presented a couple of weeks ago was solved, right? In the NEP, 90% of the funds were lodged in the central office, and that's quite dangerous, because a highly centralized budget can lead to excessive discretion by central authorities, with just one BAC to rule them all, and implementation delays because one office can only implement so much. Here in the GAB, we see that diffuse. So it's 63.69 versus 36.31. It's more in accord with 27 to 2020, around 60-40 split. Still not to 2016 levels, where only 47% was lodged in central office, 53% in regional offices. And then only 17% of 17 out of 42 DPWH flagship projects in Build were funded in the NEP. Increased to 21 out of 42. So more projects are under Build are funded in the NEP. But what's key here is you look at the amount. In the NEP, 69 billion were for Build, or 10% of the entire budget. In the GAB, that's only 21 billion. This again brings into question, well, if only 3% of the government's expenditure of the government's infrastructure is going to be spent on game-changing infrastructure that the government pushes, then what else? Then where is the 97% going to be spent? Local programs, convergence and special support programs. Now, specifically for local programs, I think 21.9 billion under the VILP, or various infra, including local projects, is for multipurpose facilities. 58.7 billion for local roads. And then when you look at the local infrastructure project, a staggering 46.5 billion for multipurpose facilities, and then 39.7 billion for local roads. And then under the national building program, around 11 billion again for multipurpose facilities. Why are we mentioning this? Why are we flagging this? Because 2021 is a pre-election year, and we're always on the lookout for funds that can be easily politicized, easily can be traded for, mga pabaon for election. A pork barrel, discretionary funds. We're always on the lookout for that, especially when it's pre-election. It's pre-election, it's 2021. All of these projects take on a more political complexion. It's not really just about project implementation anymore. It's about sometimes securing votes, right? And knowing that the government takes so much taxes from us. And it's just right that we really keep watch, especially infra. That's where the big money is. DOTR budget up 39% from GA8 to NEP, but it was cut by 20 billion in the GAB. So here, from GA8 to NEP, a big increase in Metro Manila subway, right? But that was trimmed to 28.95 billion in the GAB. Same in the North-South commuter railway system. 20 billion increase from GAA to NEP, but then the increase was almost just taken away in the GAB. They distributed some funds to aviation and maritime infrastructure because in the NEP, aviation got zero. Maritime infrastructure got around 170 million. So they added some of that. They padded that a little bit. So under the GAB, it's 3.22 billion and maritime infrastructure 0.27. Base Conversion and Development Authority, still 5.79 billion. What's noticeable is this is all hard infrastructure, right? We don't really see some programs from the DOTR for service contracting, POBs and subsidies for displaced PUV drivers. So I think the our one of our sectoral partners is going to discuss that lack of support with their proposals. And then only 5 of 40 DOTR flagship projects in the Build are included in the budget. So in the NEP, that's 99 billion or 77% of the budget. But in the GAB, 73 billion or only 68%. Social welfare budget increased by only 2 billion in the GAB. So a massive decrease when you consider GAA plus Bayanihan 1 and 2, primarily because there's no more SAP. And then from NEP to GAB, they increased this particular program, protective services for individual and families in difficult circumstances. We believe this is the catch-all program that the government made. It's less restrictive compared to the other aid programs, so they decided to add a little more to that. But again, we see that this isn't enough, and we look forward to our experts in that sector later on to talk about what the actual needs in the ground are. And then additional 4 billion for livelihood and emergency employment, but the same level of assistance for MSMEs in tourism sector. So Dole got an increase really, well, when you take into consideration 1 and 2, and then GAA, it's a decrease. But from just GAA to NEP, higher overall, and then additional 4 billion for livelihood and emergency employment in the GAB. OWA increase as well from GAA to NEP, and then just same level retained for GAB. And then DOT and DTI, Small Business Corporation, untouched by Congress. So I think these were the version that was in the NEP was retained in its entirety in the GAB. And that's cause for worry because these departments, they generate livelihoods as well, DOT and DTI, and they're often overlooked, we find in hearings and conversations like this. The DepEd increase in NEP is salary driven, and then there's little support for improvement in curriculum programs and learning tools, negligible change in the GAB version. So here you see the increase from GAA to NEP is really in general management and supervision. This was decreased from NEP to GAB. The biggest upticks are found in flexible learning options. So from 0.6, that's now 15.22 billion. We believe that's where the funds will be taken for the printing of modules. Still not enough, as we saw teachers either shelling money out of their pockets or relying on private sector or community donations just to be able to print out the modules. Computerization program as well increased from GAA to NEP, 9 billion, but that was retained. So the increase were mostly salary driven because if you look here, operation of schools, elementary, junior high, senior high, personnel services, as in sueldo, salaries, from GAA that's 352 billion, around 40 plus billion increase in the NEP, but that was again retained in the GAB. TESDA retained as well, and then CHED increased slightly, but then also retained. Little increase for agri support. Here, agri took a hit with Bayanihan 1. I think some of the capital outlays were taken out of it, but more was put into technical and support services from GAA to GAB. And then additional 1.7 billion was funneled into it from NEP to GAB, and that's only for farm to market roads. The rest was retained by Congress, wasn't really changed from the NEP version. However, again, rice still takes the lion's share of agriculture product support and sufficient to support the fisheries, right? We should not, well, first, it should be said that we should not be pitting these sectors against each other. We should not be pitting rice farmers against livestock owners and corn, high value crops, etc., etc. But it also has to be admitted that some of the recipients of rice support aren't exactly the poor farmers. Some of them are parts of like big syndicates, big organizations that produce rice. Um, and on top of the rice competitiveness enhancement fund, we believe that it's also time to pay attention to the other sectors, subsectors in agriculture, not just rice. So if you want to pay attention to agriculture, if you really want to invest in agriculture, don't put all of your support in just rice. There's livestock, corn, HBCs, organic agri, especially fisheries, because a lot of the poorest of the poor in the agri sector are actually in the fisheries sector. Not much improvement as we see in the budgets for environmental conservation and calamity response. So for 2020 GAA, the NEP is around 1.1 billion, and then that's retained in its entirety in the GAB. The NDRIM Fund, National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund, 2020 GAA was 16 billion, increased to 20 billion in the 2021 NEP and 2021 GAB. There was quite the buzz around the NDRIM Fund recently because of the successive typhoons that hit the Philippines, and we see the devastation even now. Um, so the rebuttal was that the GA they actually increased the budget for NDRIM fund. But what a lot of people were pointing out was that in 2016 the fund was around I think 38, 39 billion. But by 2017 it was cut to half by around 15.7 billion. Um, and then PNP and AFP budgets are both increased in the NEP. AFP modernization program gets an additional 2 billion in the GAB. Philippine National Police increased from GAA 2020 to 2021 NEP. I think mostly in the conduct of police patrol operations. So 142.84 up to 148.74. That was retained. No change in the GAB. However, the Armed Forces of the Philippines got a massive boost, 186.29 in GA 2020 to 203.26 in the NEP, and then an additional 2 billion in the GAB. So a lot of that comes from the AFP modernization program. I think from 2020 GAA to 2021 GAB, they got an additional 10 billion for AFP modernization. And then the support to the Barangay Development Program, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, 16.44 billion. Pension and Gratuity Fund, big increase, 116.19 to 172.89. But the hard thing about it is this is very hard to stop. I don't think any executive in his right mind would try to take away the pension gratuity fund from the military and uniformed personnel. And that's quite the problem because it does eat up space, considerable fiscal space that could have been used for social protection and livelihood assistance. And then we have the confidential and intelligence expenses of the Office of the President, 2.25 billion each, so still retained. So this invites questions as to what Ralph pointed out earlier. Is this really a budget that's equipped to deal with COVID-19? I think the government has acknowledged that COVID-19 exists just because it issued the lockdowns, etc., etc. But the question is, what is its policy in dealing with COVID-19? For 2021, for example, will it deal with COVID-19 by minimizing it, reducing the risk, and trying to go back to how we were doing before? Or is the policy just to hunker down and wait for a vaccine to come so that things will return to normal on their own? No, how do we rebound and recover from the worst downturn on record? The avalanches in funding mostly go to infrastructure spending, which include patronage-driven projects, especially in light of the fact that 2021 is a pre-election year. There will be no additional cash transfers for DSWD. The budgets for DOLE, DTI, and DOT barely change. These are our livelihood assistance and employment departments. There's no budget for service contracting for PUPs. DepEd budget cannot adequately support distance learning. More resources are poured into ending communist insurgency in the drug war. No? So here, a short summary of what's to come later. Our sectors have rallied together and proposed programs that could remedy this situation. So the question is, okay, if this budget isn't really equipped to deal with COVID, what does a budget that deals with COVID look like? So here are some proposed programs. So SAP 3, social pension for indigent senior citizens, expanded. Active transport, service contracting, road infra, funding for printing of modules for the rest of the year, and then wage subsidies for micro and small enterprises. I won't belabor these because that's for our other panelists to go through later. But it's very hopeful and very timely that we have these figures, these proposals, because these are things that we can go to Congress through and ask for. Um, Next question is, okay, fine, you have those items. Where do we get them from? Here we this is, on our opinion, a list of the things of the pools of funds that we could draw from. DPWH for sure, also DOTR, and then NTF-LCAC, the contingent fund, pension gratuity fund, confidential intelligence fund of the president, and the AFP-GHQ, the modernization program of the AFP, subsidy to the BCDA, and the House of Representatives. So in sum, just to conclude, no significant difference between budget priorities reflected in the 2021 NEP and the 2021 GAB. So the observations that we've been talking about for the past weeks, they still hold for the GAB version. Infrastructure still takes up much of the fiscal space, no additional budgets for COVID health response, and insufficient livelihood support, economic assistance, and stimulus. Generally, 2021 GAB is still unresponsive to the urgent needs of the various sectors. Fiscal intervention is key to recovery, but if the intervention is misguided, then recovery might take longer than it should. Maybe we might have to take more negative growth figures in the future than we normally should. And then infrastructure spending remains slow. If we are to build ourselves out of this crisis, then shouldn't infra spending actually improve or like increase in quality? 2021 GAP still favors politicians and military. Major reallocations in DPWH for patronage-driven projects. So the local program projects that were brought up earlier eat up about 200 billion of the fiscal space. And that the GAP still favors the military. So you have NTF-LCAC, 16.44 billion. Now, if you imagine, when you add the budgets for DOLE, DTI, and DOT, I don't think it even approaches 16.44 billion. Increase in AFP modernization funds as well. So other concerns to keep in mind, we're in a global and domestic recession, widening fiscal deficit, which really shouldn't be a problem if it is being spent on the right things. Increased unemployment, it improved from ECQ times, but it's still higher compared to what's normal. And then more returning OFWs, and those who returned aren't really going back. They're not really getting deployed. 2021 is a pre-election year. So a lot of projects take on a more political complexion. A lot of decisions become more and more political. Challenges to the delivery of key services, social protection, education, other extension services, non-COVID health needs, and disaster response. And then preparations to implement the Mandanas ruling. Remember, this is supposed to be implemented by 2022. So 2021, there's bound to be renegotiations between the national and local governments as to the services that they will deliver. Then, of course, other emerging infectious diseases. But before I stop, I'd enjoin the viewers to listen intently and actively engage with our sectoral representatives, because for weeks we've been talking about the budget, what is the budget, and what ought to be the budget. And I think it's high time, it's crunch time. We start talking about how do we enact, how do we change the budget, how do we actually influence the budget making process. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Robert, for trying to squeeze in all those issues under 30 minutes. It's quite comprehensive and I don't know, quite disturbing or disappointing on how, yeah, I'm trying to hold back on my thoughts on that because we still have lots of panelists. Let's listen to Ana Luna and Tanya Quijano. For the social protection bit, just a little background, Tanya has worked for the DSWD for 5 years, acting as its head executive assistant, and she has also worked with national agencies, local governments, and international organizations, and also also a passionate advocate for human and social economic rights. Meanwhile, Annabel Luna is Secretary General for Samahan ng Nagkakaisang Pamilya ng Pantawid. She has been involved with the DSWD, LGUs, and other stakeholders in coming up with decisions, steps, and advocacies of the organization. So let's start first with Tanya. Hi, Tanya.
Hello, hi Ralph. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Robert, for that presentation and again for your invitation no, para sa amin ni Ate Ana. So kasama ko si Ate Ana na magdi-discuss tungkol sa pananaw at mga insights mula sa sektor na ito. So nabanggit na rin kanina, naging talagang malaki ang epekto ng pandemic sa milyong-milyong Pilipino, pero pinakahigit talaga na naapektuhan yung ating vulnerable sectors, lalo na yung may hirap kapos sa buhay, ating mga seniors at yung mga may kapansanan. So, narinig rin natin no, lately sa news na meron ng bakuna pero matagal-tagal pa rin talaga ito na makakarating. So, sa palagay ko magiging matagal pa rin talaga yung mga epekto ng pandemic sa atin. At sana makita natin yun sa budget na gagawin ng ating gobyerno. So, through our monitoring, we also found out na marami nakatanggap ng SAP, pero naging madugo talaga at mabagal yung pagbigay nito. And kahit na ganun, marami pa ring issue na naranasan tungkol sa pagpili ng mga beneficiaries, paano ito nila nakuha. So mamaya si Ate Ana siguro mag-share siya ng mga examples na yun. Simula rin, narinig natin na kahit na may ayuda, or may SAP, marami pa rin hanggang sa ngayon ang wala pa ring trabaho o pinagkukuhanan ng pagkakakitaan nila. So sa palagay namin, ito talaga yung sa mga unang bagay na kailangan bigyan ng pansin. So ano ba yung mga rekomendasyon namin? So overview lang ito. Later on, bibigyan to ng din ni Ate Ana and sharing ko ano yung mga experiences nila. So we found out, no, I think during our last session on social protection, meron pang 10 billion rin na natira sa SAP na sa ngayon, yung DSWD, they are proposing to have this as a livelihood grant din. And then you also found in the proposal na meron ding konting funds pa for livelihood grants. Pero this cumulatively, siguro around less than 1 million lang ang makakatanggap nito at merong mahabang proseso no, with the LGU na mag-i-endorse sa kanila. So sa ngayon, kailangan pa rin ng mabilisang aksyon. So sa palagay namin, magandang laanan pa rin ng budget ang cash transfer o SAP na gagamitin rin naman sa kanilang pangkabuhayan. So based on our initial calculation, at least mga 10.4 million pa maaari ang kailangan nitong ayuda na ito na mabilisan. Kahit na na-increase yung AIX, ito kasi yung parang assistance to crisis individuals. So magandang bigyan pa rin yun ng pansin and by now dapat naayos na rin yung mga proseso ng pagbibigay ng SAP na ito. Next, doon sa pagkuha rin no, ng mga ng pagkakaroon ng pagkakitaan, baka mamagat na rin mamaya pero babanggitin ko na rin yung pagkakaroon ng mga cash for work na program. So, pwede itong gawin kasama yung mga ahensya, industriya, o kaya local governments na may mga na nangangailangan ng tulong at pwedeng magbigay ng employment. So, pwede itong mga additional contact tracers o kaya teacher assistants, construction workers o pagbabantay o pagbibigay serbisyo sa kanilang mga barangay. So, sa ganung paraan, nakakatulong tayo no, sa pagpuksa pa rin ng pandemya dahil as Robert also mentioned before na ito talaga yung main na issue no. And then magpa-follow doon na magkakaroon tayo ng sapat na protection sa kanila pero pangkabuhayan na rin. So yun siguro yung mga babanggitin ko. And then, additional din, no? So, part ng mga vulnerable sectors na pwede rin nating i-propose na madaling gawin is yung pag-increase ng pension no for social pension para sa ating mga senior citizens kasi alam naman natin na sila talaga yung pinaka-vulnerable sa panahon ngayon. So meron na ring listahan ito no. So meron ng 91,000 na na-identify na waitlisted. So konti na lang pwede na rin talaga silang ma-include doon sa programa. Matagal na rin tong usapin pero ito ay isang important na next step for this sector. And with that, we hopefully na given these discussions ay wala talaga tayo may iwan na sector na nangangailangan talaga ng protection at ayuda sa panahon ngayon. So ngayon tatawagin ko naman si Ate Ana ng SNPP. Siya ang ating Secretary General at magbibigay pa siya ng diin at ulat kung bakit importante talaga na bigyan ng vaccine ang ating mga vulnerable sectors sa ngayon. Yes, Ate Ana. Ay, yung ano lang po, yung audio natin. Thank you. Naka-mute pa po. Yan.
Okay. Good afternoon po. Bali, yun nga, nakakatuwa kasi may mga ganitong mga discussion, no, para maipabot ng sektor namin yung mga totoong nangyayari sa ground. Yung mga kapwa po namin, yun, nangangailangan pa po talaga ng sapat na tulong na galing sa gobyerno. Kailangan pa talaga ng additional na ayuda kasi nagpapasalamat sa nabigay ng SAP pero hindi yun sapat dahil alam naman natin na itong pandemya ay tuloy-tuloy, hanggang ngayon hindi pa naman talaga natutugunan, and then sunod-sunod pa yung bagyo na dumating, 'no? Kaya yung mga kapwa namin, yung mga vulnerable sector ay hindi alam kung papaano babangon. Madaling sabihin bumangon, 'di ba? Pero papaano? Siyempre dapat ang gobyerno bigyan pansin na talagang protektado yung hindi lang sa COVID-19, kailangan din talaga na dagdag, pagkakakitaan kasi hindi naman lalo na sa 4Ps ang sabi ginagawang tamad, 'di ba? Hindi ho lahat ng 4Ps ay tamad at talagang nagtatrabaho at gumagawa talaga ng paraan kung paano pa dadagdagan yung kita. Lalo na ngayon sa pinagdadaanan natin, napakahalaga po na yung SAP na kasi marami pa nga waitlisted, ilang milyon pa yon na naghihintay na hindi nga nila alam kung ang hinihintay nila ay darating. Kaya nakakatuwa na meron tayo dito ngayon na yung Sustainable Livelihood Assistance Grant. Kasi yung disenyo ng proyekto, grant siya, 'di ba? Magagamit yon. Pero siyempre hindi rin sapat, kulang 'yun kasi parang kulang-kulang 300,000 lang ang benepisyaryo na makakakuha nito. At sana rin hindi ito magamit na yung bang ma-politicize, magamit sa maagang pangangampanya, sa korapsyon. Dahil hin yung nakaraang SAP, ang daming naranasan ng ating mga kapwa na mahihirap dun sa pagpili, yung assessment, 'di ba? Nakikita natin na hindi maayos, mabagal na, hindi pa maayos, tapos umaasa ang lahat na na mapapadali ito kasi nga pandemic, kasi nga nasa krisis tayo ngayon. Kailangan agaran. Katulad ngayon, ang Marikina, ang Rizal, 'di ba? Nakita natin na wala na yung sabihin natin wala na yung putik, hindi na bakas, pero makikita mo sa loob ng bahay nila, nakarating kami, makikita mo na yung materials ng kanyang mga bahay nangangailangan po ng pagpapalit kasi hindi na safe, Ayun, saan saan nila kukuhaing kamay ng Diyos 'yun, 'di ba? Kailangan yung gobyerno, magdagdag pa ng konting ayuda na sasapat talaga na hindi lang bang pakitang tao nagbigay kami, pero siguraduhin yung kasiguraduhan na safe yung mga taong tinutulungan, and then alalahanin po natin na kahit, nasa ganitong sitwasyon tayo, ah, malaki ang magagawa ng gobyerno kung ang pagtututukan yung social protection. Kasi hindi naman makakatulong yung build ngayon kasi alam naman natin na sino magtatrabaho diyan, yung mga manggagawa rin, gutom, wala rin saysay. Pero kung magkakaroon tayo ng cash forward, yun nga nabanggit nga, na hindi lang basta nagbigay kundi nakatulong din, 'di ba? Nabigyan ng trabaho at ang alam naman po natin na ang mga PWD, ang mga senior ay nangangailangan talaga. Kahit naman din sa mga senior, meron pa ring gustong magtrabaho pero wala nga tayong maibigay, 'di ba? May kakayanan pa sila, fit to work pa sila, pero anong trabaho puwede sa kanila? Dapat may itap din ang gobyerno na reading-ready na matulungan talaga yung ating mga kapwa na nangangailangan at gustong bumangon talaga, yung totoong pagbangon ang kailangan namin na sa ganitong mga sitwasyon. Kaya kailangan talaga ah, dagdag na ano, na investment sa kanilang mga pension. Kasi po alam naman natin na pang-maintenance lang po kulang na kulang 'yan. Eh, karamihan po delay na delay pa po 'yan. Aanuhin mo yung damo kung patay na yung kabayo. Napakabagal po talaga ng pagtugon. Maganda itong ating ginagawa kasi tayo yung nagbabantay, nagmamatsag para rin naman hindi naman para punahin, kung hindi makatulong tayo kung sa ikakaayos ng ating bayan, 'di ba? Tayo-tayo rin lang naman 'yun, eh. Kaya ayun nga po, yung mga rekomendasyon na nabanggit din ni Ma'am Tanya, napakabisa po niyan lalo na po yung SAP 3, alam naman natin walang SAP 3, 'no? Pero kung maglalagay sila ng SAP 3, yung talagang mga yung makakatanggap yung bigyan ng ano, pag-alalay ng gobyerno para maipasama dun sa programa na ayon sa kanilang pangangailangan. Kasi katulad niyan malaking bagay po 'yan yung mga nabahaan. Hindi lang naman, tama na yung food pack diyan, eh. Maraming salamat 'yan, nagpapasalamat, panatawid, gutom po 'yan. Pero mas maganda po kung tuloy-tuloy ang pagtulong na mismo sarili nila tutulungan nila kasi mabibigyan din sila ng panimula at mabibigyan sila ng pagkakakitaan. Dapat tignan po natin na dito sa pandemic lahat lahat ng sektor na apektado. Kaya dapat mas tinitignan ng ating gobyerno na mas maayos, mas sapat na pondo para sa social protection. Kasi lahat tayo gusto nating, tumulong. Paano ka tutulong kung ikaw ay naghihina na, 'di ba? Kasi tayo-tayo magtutulungan, maghahatakang pataas, pero kung ang gobyerno walang walang pagtingin sa atin, saan pa ho tayo pupulutin? Malamang sabi nga ang poorest of the poor, extremely poor na kung patuloy na pababayaan. Walang saysay po ang lahat. Dapat talaga bigyan ng magandang pananaw, bigyan ng magandang, proteksyon, bigyan ng sapat na tulong na hindi lang talaga pinansyal, pero napakahalaga nun. Pero dapat talaga, yung talagang konkretong pagtugon dito sa pandemic natin at sa mga darating pa nating, pagdaraanan. Alam naman natin 'yun, eh, 'no? Ayun, maraming salamat po kasi basta masiguro lang na talagang walang maiiwan na sektor sa panahon ngayon, lalo na sa ating, krisis na kinakaharap.
Okay, thanks so much, Tanya and Ana. Now, let's hear naman yung masasabi ni James Francis Miradora, co-convener of Aral Pilipinas. James is a student and a development practitioner and serves as co-convener of Aral Pilipinas, a group of education practitioners, parents, students, and development workers who are advocating for the continuity of education, even times of this pandemic and other crises. Hi, James.
Hi, Ralph. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. First, allow me to introduce the group I represent. So as mentioned nga by Ralph, we are Ara Pilipinas. We advocate for the continuity of education in times of crisis. So we are conducting consultations with various groups of teachers, parents, and their children, especially yung sa basic ed, hearing stories how they adjusted and continuing to adjust in distance learning, what are their needs and concerns, and then elevating these accounts to policymakers. Ngayon, ang immediate goal ng aming grupo is to ensure that the costs of blended learning are not passed on to students and their families. And that's why in the recent weeks and until habang pinag-uusapan yung 2021 national budget, we are continuously reaching out to Congress to provide support to the Department of Education in the implementation of blended learning. Now on the budget, we are pushing for a higher budget for flexible learning options kasi tama si Robert na dito kunin yung pondo para sa production of self-learning modules. Now probably one would ask bakit modules, no? Bakit di na lang online? Base kasi sa recent enrollment survey results ng Department of Education, around 15 million learners ang mangangailangan ng self-learning modules, and that is more than half of the total number of learners enrolled. So reflective ito ng context and needs of our learners. No? Many parts of the country still do not have access to stable internet connection, electricity, and lalo pa ngayon na mas pinahirap because of the series of typhoons. So kung gusto natin ng blended learning approach na accessible sa Filipino learners, we must support the funding for their production of modules. Now, specific doon sa item, no, sa flexible learning options, sa presentation ni Robert kanina, nakita natin na from 600 million in the 2020 budget to 15 billion in the proposed budget ang tinaas ng flexible learning options. So, if I'm not mistaken, ito yung ito yung item sa budget ng DepEd na may pinakamalaking itinaas. But despite that, bakit may naririnig pa rin tayong kwento or narratives na gumagastos mismo yung mga magulang, yung mga teachers sa pag-print ng modules? Some of them are even soliciting donations for reams of bond paper para lang ma-print yung mga modules, no? So that's how we arrive, yung grupo namin, we arrive at a costing study kung magkano ba talaga yung kakailanganin for modular learning for the entire school year. So considering yung data from the Department of Education, yung latest enrollment figures per grade level, the number of most essential learning competencies. So basically, these are trimmed down key areas per subject for remote learning. And then the percentage ng enrolled learners mo nang pumili ng modular modality, which is again more than half, no, ng total learners natin. Taking into account those data, no, kakailanganin ng additional 52 billion as presented as well by Robert, or at least 40 billion on top of what's already provided in the GAB if we take into account other possible sources like Bayanihan 2 and other Bayanihan 2 na I think dapat ma-release na, and realign funds from the Department of Education. Kasi yun din, during the deliberations of Congress, no, na-raise din ng DepEd yung kakulangan doon sa budget for the printing of self-learning modules. Otherwise, mapo-force tayo na mag-share yung mga learners, na mag-share ang dalawang learners sa isang modules, which we do not want to happen for obvious health precautions. At saka added work din ito for teachers na since sila rin yung magdi-disinfect kapag binalik sa school si modules, no. Lastly, just last month, no, we partnered with SNPP, Samahan ng Nagkaisang Pamilyang Pantawid, kina Ate Ana, no. Humingi kami ng tulong sa kanila for the rollout of survey, basically para sa mga parents na ang objective ay kunin yung pulso ng mga magulang about blended learning. So kung papipiliin ba sila ulit, anong modality ang pipiliin nila, nadagdagan ba ang gastos o pareho lang, at kung open ba sila sa possibility na pabalikin yung mga anak nila once nag-open ng school. So preliminary results of the data show na yung mga currently gumagamit ng modular modality, they will still choose modules, no, as the primary modality, and they're also open to the possibility na mag-open, sending back their children to schools if feel nila na safe na, kasi mahirap din yung homeschool. So nandun yung availability, time, at yung capacity ng parents or guardians to guide the learners, no. So I'll end it with that. But again, if you want to have a blended learning approach na cognizant sa needs and situations of learners, and if we genuinely want education to continue, we should be with DepEd on this. Hopefully, we can give support by calling for an increased budget on FLOs, flexible learning options, to effectively implement blended learning. So thank you. I'll end with that so we can have more questions later.
Thanks so much, James. Now, I'll call on Joshua Mata, co-convener of the Labor Coalition Nagkaisa.
Thanks, Ralph, and thanks to everyone for those fantastic presentations. If you may allow me, mag-screen share lang ako para pakita ko lang ilang slides na pinrepare namin. Actually, mas madali na yung gagawin ko kasi naipaliwanag na ng mga nauna nagsalita yung iba, so dagdag na lang ito, no? Gusto ko lang sabihin na isang nakaka-frustrate nung pinakinggan ko yung presentation kanina ay yung reality talaga na hanggang ngayon, walang agenda ang gobyerno to address yung jobs crisis natin. No? At yun yung gusto kong dinan dito. No? So kita naman na natin to yung mga statistics na to. So sa PSA, noong July, lumabas na halos 1/3 ng ating labor force are underutilized. July yan, no? Mas mataas dun sa, halos pareho lang, no? Kung kukumpara mo, no? Pero mas mataas ang idea dahil magkaiba ng definition, mas mataas ang unemployment para sa SWS. Sabi nila 27.3 million. Sa PSA kasi, pag inad mo yung underemployed at saka unemployed, lalabas din na roughly 27 million yan. No? Yung ILO, gumawa ng isang unpublished na report. At ang sabi ng ILO, papalo sa 9.8 to 10.9 million na mga manggagawa ang tinamaan, no, o tatamaan itong COVID na ito. Baka mas maganda, tignan natin ano yung projection, no, ng ilang mga institutions. At yung IMF mismo ang nagsabi na sa atin na ina-expect nila na by the end of this year, 10.4% ang magiging unemployment ng ating bansa, which is double, no, than what we usually have. So that's roughly around 4.7 million, more than double than normally 2 million that we have for the past several years. Now, that's a jobs crisis. The thing is, ano ang plano ng gobyerno dito? That's the problem, no? Hindi namin nakikita dito sa budget. Meron silang konti na para sa mga parang ayuda na ibibigay mula na pumasok sa dole budget, pero yon ay para ayuda lamang, no? Tingin namin sa ganito ka-massive na problema, hindi lang ayuda ang dapat pinag-iisipan natin. Bakit? Kasi hindi talaga papasok ang private sector, hindi talaga yung private sector ang mag-a-address ng jobs crisis natin. Sino ba naman ang negosyante nagugustuhin mag-invest sa panahon na walang market, walang confidence? Sabi nyo nga kanina, no, yung mga mamimili natin. Talagang pagkaganyan, yung estado na mismo, yung gobyerno na mismo, ang dapat na mag-step in bilang employer of a last resort. And this is the reason why nagkaisa, which is a broad coalition of trade unions. It's the broadest coalition of trade unions in the Philippines na nire-represent ko ngayon. By the way, I'm Joshua Mata and I'm from Centro. And Centro is part of Nagkaisa. No, bumuo kami ng proposed na Unemployment Support and Workers Assistance Guarantee, tinatawag namin USWAG. Sa mga Bisaya, that means, pag-forward, no, pagsulong. At may mga key components ito. No? Una dyan yung income guarantees na pwede mo nang sabihin na bahagi yan ng pinaliwanag kanina sa atin, no? Yung mga SAP, pwede mo nang idagdag to. Kaya hindi ko na pupuntahan yon. Wage subsidies is designed to save yung existing jobs. Pero para sa mga manggagawang mawawalan talaga ng trabaho, kailangan mag-likha tayo ng trabaho para sa kanila. Kaya gusto namin ng employment guarantees, gusto rin namin ng paid training para sa mga manggagawang mawalan ng trabaho. At para madagdagan ang trabaho, kailangan nating lawakan pa ang public employment, ang public sector natin. No, sa totoo lang, there are more than 87,000 yata na mga, sa dinig na, sa podita namin, may 87,000 na mahigit na mga plantilla ng public sector natin na hindi pa rin nati-fill up, na pwede sanang fill upan, and therefore makakabawas yan, no, sa massive unemployment na meron tayo. Now, I'm just flashing these few assumptions just to tell everyone that meron na hindi naman namin pinitas ang mga figures namin na kung saan lang. No? So halimbawa, pag pinag-usapan natin ng wage subsidy, again, ang focus nito ay yung mga manggagawa nagtatrabaho sa mga MSMEs, no? Particularly sa micro and small industry enterprises, kasi sila yung pinaka-vulnerable. No? At ang pinagbatayan lang namin dito ay yung sinabi na mismo na Employers Confederation, no? Na 48% daw ng mga firms ay lalo na ng mga nasa MSMEs ay nag-struggle. So, tinignan namin yan, no? Hinanap na, yan ang ginawa namin ng calculations. At ito yung lumabas. So, again, hindi namin sinama dito medium, micro lang and small. At pagka pinagsama mo yung dalawang yan, 5 million na yan, no? Ng mga manggagawa. Nag-assume kami na ng 75% na lang ng wage nila. Parang ang idea ng wage subsidy, the government provides 75% at dito nga meron pa kami calculation for 50% na lang kung namamahalan sila sa 75%. The government comes in, they provide the 75 to 50 to 75% of the wages ng mga manggagawang ito so that they can help yung mga enterprises na to stay afloat. No? And we do this for 3 months, hoping na in the next 3 months after that ay nag-perk up na uli yung market niya. No? At ang lumabas na calculation namin, yung tinotal namin yan for 3 months, anywhere yan from 29 billion, 29.3 billion for 50% ang ating calculation, or 44 billion kung 75% ang sasagutin ng gobyerno. So that's for the wage subsidy. But these are for people na may trabaho pa, subalit nanganganib na baka mawalan ng trabaho pag nagsara yung kanilang kumpanya. That's the idea. This is essentially, it's to save jobs. However, what do you do with that with the 4 million no, na wala ng trabaho? Doon papasok ang employment guarantee. Again, we did some calculation and these are some of our assumptions. No? Una, ang hindi namin tinatarget pa dito yung buong 4 million na higit na mawawala ng trabaho na iniestima ng IMF. Kahit na lang yung dagdag na nawalan ng trabaho because of the pandemic natin yan. Yun na lang. No? Kahit yun lang. At mga 2 million nga yan. No? At ang assumption namin, 22 working days yan, ang idea ay mag-provide ang gobyerno sa kanila ng trabaho talaga. No? At kinalculate namin yan using yung average na minimum wage no, ng mga manggagawa on a national level. No? And we came up with a figure ng 48 billion. No? So sa madaling salita, pag tinotal nyo yan, ay nako, napakalit na bahagi po niyan pag kinumpara ninyo dun sa build na 600 billion. Pero ito, sigurado po tayo dito na mayroon tayong trabaho maliligtas at may mga manggagawang magkakatrabaho. And by the way, the employment guarantee could either be actual jobs for 3 months. Hindi ito yung katulad nung ginagawa ngayon sa tupad ng mga 10 days. Tingin namin dapat minimum ng 3 months yan. No? And they should have that opportunity to either work no or be trained no pero bayad pa rin sila. Now, bakit mahalaga na ma-expand pa natin ang trabaho at gobyerno ang mamuno rito? Apart from the fact na sa tingin namin ay kailangan mag-generate ng trabaho yung gobyerno, tingin din namin hindi natin pwedeng iasa sa private sector, hindi lang yung pag-generate ng trabaho sa panahon ng crisis, kundi yung paggawa ng mga bagay na hindi talaga pagkakakitaan. Halimbawa, sa panahon ng pandemic, kailangan natin talaga na mas maraming mga public health workers natin, like contact tracers. Or kung gusto natin maibsan ang sangkatutak na problemang dinadanas natin sa mga lumalalang mga typhoons na tumatama sa ating bansa, kailangan natin ng napakaraming mga climate jobs. No? At tingin namin doon dapat nagpo-focus ito. Climate jobs like reforestation, coastal river and coastal rehabilitation, as well as yung pagtatayo ng mga renewable energy sources para sa atin. No? So yan po yung calculation ng labor and we really hope na ito ay mapakinggan din ng ating gobyerno dahil sa tingin namin makakatulong ito ng malaki para makaalis tayo sa ating crisis. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Joshua. And sundutin ko lang, no, actually yung GDP natin double-digit yung decline ng third quarter. So projections right now are mas gloomier.
It's really grim.
GDP yung target natin is around -5 na contraction, no, but that has to be reviewed again since double-digit yung third quarter. So more on that, but let's listen to Ken Abante now. He's a policy researcher of the Ateneo de Manila University. He will briefly discuss issues on mobility and the priorities of the Duterte administration. Hi, Ken.
Hi, magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. I-share ko lang po yung presentation ng Move as One na endorsed din po ng Health Professionals Alliance for COVID. I was wondering po whether nakikita niyo po yung presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So the presentation is called Investing in Public Transport for Pandemic Response and Recovery. Ito po yung sabi ng mga doktor po natin na ka-organize po namin sa Move as One. Countries that reopened their economies are having a harder, worse second wave of COVID cases. Ang kailangan po para mag-reopen ang ekonomiya ng ligtas, kailangan po mag-invest in safe, sufficient, stable public transportation. The question that we ask is, if these countries that have better public transport systems experienced this worst second wave, how much more for us who don't? No, so yun po yung sinasabi ng ating mga partner epidemiologists from each pack. Ang sabi rin po ng Health Professionals Alliance ay para po maging ligtas yung ating public transportation system, at least 3 of these 4 measures are needed to mitigate or reduce COVID-19 infection risk. Ang tawag po nila dito ay kahit saan dapat pumunta, 4 dapat. So, ang pinakamahalaga, air circulation, physical distance of 1 meter or more, always wear mask and face shields, and then 30 minutes interaction or less. Bakit ko po kinakwento itong 4 dapat? Dahil nakalapat po ang budget priorities ng Move as One Coalition on Public Transport dito po sa health measures. As much as the economy needs the confidence, needs to restore confidence, we should also restore the confidence in public transportation by ensuring that it's safe. At bawat isa po sa mga prioridad at polisiya na isinisulong po ng Move as One Coalition, which is a coalition of more than 140 organizations and 77,000 individual signatories, is dito nga po nakalapat siya sa safety and restoring confidence in public transportation. So, ang proposal po namin ay magkaroon ng budget para sa service contracting, para po sa mga jeepney drivers and bus drivers and PUV drivers, para ma-enforce po yung safe distance. Magkaroon din po ng budget para sa active transportation tulad ng mga bike lanes, bike parking, and other bike infrastructure para po sa safe open-air travel, at public transport infrastructure tulad po ng PUV-only lanes, stops, and depots para po ma-minimize po yung exposure habang bumabiyahe po yung ating mga kapatid na commuters. Bakit po kailangan i-fund ito? Ito po yung mga major budget messages namin. Yung una po ay it decreases COVID risk and promotes health. It helps enforce health regulations in transport. Yung second po ay it corrects historical underfunding. At kung babalikan niyo po yung mga budgets na nakalipas para po sa road-based public transportation, no wonder why we're still in traffic congestion, no? At hindi pa po na tutupad yung pangako na masosolve natin yung traffic, no? So road-based public transportation has just gotten 12 billion pesos the past 4 years, 2016 to 2019. This is just 0.02% of GDP. No, napakaliit po nito kumpara sa costs po ng bad mobility. So every year, 7% of GDP is lost to traffic congestion, greater than 2% of GDP is lost to road crashes, and more unquantifiables due to air pollution, road pollution, and biodiversity loss because of bad mobility. We shouldn't invest in more road widening projects because road widening, as has been shown time and again in urban mobility literature, actually just causes traffic ang sabi po dito sa literature nito, sa mga pag-aaral, induced demand. Ang tawag po dito sa teoryang ito. Pag pinalawak nyo yung mga kalsada, dadami yung kotse at lalala yung traffic. Yung pang-apat po na dahilan kung bakit kailangang i-fund ito ay nawala po yata yung aking presentation. Yung pang-apat pong dahilan kung bakit kailangang i-fund ito ay meron pong large economic and employment multipliers ang road-based transport. Yung land transport multiplier po ay 2.7 times. Mas mataas po at least in 2012 than infrastructure projects tulad ng build. At mataas din po yung employment multiplier per million pesos of output, nasa 4.4 times. So the best investments now, sabi nga po ni Robbie C., who is one of our co-conveners sa Move as One Coalition, the best investment now is not a train that will likely be completed in late 2021, 2022. It's not even more road widening projects. No, it's better protected bike lanes and road-based infrastructure. And many people actually depend on transportation. So 2.7 million employed in land transport, of which 1.4 million are drivers, and even more are commuters. Ano po yung mangyayari kapag hindi natin finund yung service contracting? Ang service contracting po kasi ay para siyang kontrata para magkaroon ng stable income yung ating mga kapatid na transport workers ay para po mag-move from yung passenger-based boundary system to a service-based contract, no, na may wage, may sapat na kita, makataong kita ang ating mga transport workers. Kung hindi po ito matransform, services will remain unstable, insufficient, and uncertain. Operators and drivers will be at risk of going bankrupt. Commuters will continue to be hesitant to use public transport, and compliance with sanitation protocols will be weak. So for economic recovery to actually unfold, kailangan ng stable and sufficient public transport. And no less than the Economic Secretary, si Secretary Chua, has mentioned this in one of his presentations. So one of the reasons why we had such a bad recession was because we did not invest in adequate public transportation. And the 2021 budget, hindi pa po naka-reflect itong klase ng priority na ito. So kailangan po nating suportahan yung ating economic managers dito sa clear naman po na nakikita nila na prioridad ito. Kailangan mag-reflect yung budget nito. So, marami po mga detalye na pwede ko pong ikwento. Kailangan po ng subsidy is needed because fares are kept low and affordable. Kapag hindi po nabigay yung service contracting budget na full, just a tenth po of demand, pre-COVID demand will be reached. No? So in the current budget, nandito lang po tayo sa mga 6.6 billion pesos. Kailangan po nating iakyat yan, yung budget na yan. And then local governments, ito po yung kailangan po, ito rin po yung mensahe namin sa national government and to local governments. Local governments should be involved in service contracting for improved program implementation and absorptive capacity. So nag-propose po kami ng lengguwahe dun sa special provision ng budget. And the reason why this is so is because some LGUs are willing actually to implement and to provide counterpart financing for service contracting. So if the national government wants to really push this nationwide, kailangan maging klaro dun sa rules na dapat isama yung LGUs as implementing partners because they know the transport situation on the ground. So ito po yung halimbawa ng Metro Naga ng Naga City Ordinance where they said, game po kaming mag-fund, mag-co-finance nito. Ito naman po yung Metro Cebu Technical Working Group recommendations on service contracting where they said, where they're actually already planning for an implementation scale up. So LGUs are game to support this program. So of course, meron din po tayong active transport budget for protected bike lanes, and then bike racks and consultant services, and then yung ating mga PUV-only lanes for road transport infrastructure budget. If these are not given in all, yung next best po is magkaroon ng DPWH special provision. No, yung special provision po na ito ay magsasabi na at least half po dapat ng ating road space ay allocated to walking, biking, or cycling. So again, the solution to traffic is not widening the roads, it's reallocating the great inequality of road space, where 88% of households who do not own cars, at least in Metro Manila, should be given more road space. And then pedestrian crossings should at default be road at grade, especially for persons with disability, senior citizens, pregnant women, and children. No, and any funding in road and bridge infrastructure in 2021 should be modified. Diyan po nagtatapos yung aking quick presentation. Again po, the road-based transport budget is a health investment. And if we don't invest in road-based infrastructure, we will not be able to get out of COVID, and the economy will continue to be in shambles, and people will continue to lose their jobs. Salamat po.
Thanks so much, Ken. Marami akong tanong, but let's listen to our last panelist, no, si Ms. Marita Rodriguez. the Executive Director of NGOs for Fisheries Reform. Hi, ma'am.
Hello, magandang hapon, Ralph. Magandang hapon sa lahat. Let me just share my very short presentation. Naka-disable. Anyway, i-discuss ko na lang. As I have discussed in our past budget forum, the fisher folk had a hard time. Ang naging problema nila sa COVID, they had a hard time transporting their fish products to the market. And all coupled with the lack of supply of ice and the problems with mobility, bumagsak yung presyo ng mga isda. So, opportunity sana na there was less fishing pressure, and those that were able to fish had a good catch, pero bumagsak naman yung presyo ng isda. Ang nakikita namin, una, in the light of not only of COVID but also of the increasing intensity of strong typhoons, nakikita namin for the environment ang importance talaga ng mangrove protection. Nakita naman natin sa presentation kanina, no, na there is little budget, but at least there is a budget for forestry and watershed. So, yung mangrove refo, actually, sa tingin ko, may dalawang pwedeng pagkunan. Yung coastal and marine ecosystems rehabilitation budget line item and forest and watershed management. Di ko lang sure kung the figures presented were really enough to ensure significant improvements in our mangrove ecosystems with those little budgets. Importante kasi talaga yung mangrove, yun nga, as I mentioned, in the light of the increasing intensity of typhoons. Bilang ako ay galing sa NGOs for Fisheries Reform, let me also present some proposals which can fall under agriculture. Nabanggit kanina, no, ang liit ng support sa fisheries. While hindi naman masama na buhusan ng pondo ang rice, pero sana may sapat na tulong din for fisheries. Ang nakikita namin dito, una, yung livelihood assistance, this can be through the community fish landing centers. Existing program na ito ng BFAR, kaya lang ang problema, very few of those constructed fish landing centers are operational. Kailangan pa kasi din ng dagdag na pondo nito to serve as hub for trading of fish products. We estimate a modest amount of 1 million per CFLC times 728 CFLCs. Ang paggagamitan ng pondo, freezers and other equipments like ice-making machines, capacity building of fisher folk cooperatives that will manage the fish landing centers. Sana meron ding risk assessment kasi especially coastal areas ito. And then vehicles to transport fish produce to major markets and seed capital to buy fish harvest. Dagdag na assistance for the transport of fish catch. Malaki rin lang naman yung budget for farm to market roads. Sana ito na pag-usapan natin to last time, pero sana yung location na ma-identify for the farm to market roads ay yung from the coastal, yun talaga ma-connect yung coastal areas, specifically yung fish landing centers to major markets. Para yung mga nako-consolidate na mga isda dun sa fish landing centers ay mabilis na mata-transport sa major markets. We also propose a municipal fishery officer for each LGUs. Ito naman yung this can be ensuring that there is a fisheries technician or fisheries officer in coastal LGUs para may talagang nakatutok sa pag-address ng pangangailangan ng mga mangingisda. And then yung sa fisherfolk settlement areas, kasi kawawa talaga yung mga mangingisda, especially in the light of increasing intensity of typhoons. Mandated naman ito under RA 8550 pero magulo pa kung paano i-implement dahil sinasabi na the BFAR has no mandate to to allocate resources for housing kasi meron tayong National Housing Authority. Pero sana maayos na ito. The National Anti-Poverty Commission has many years of lobbying work on this at meron na rin silang mga computations. For instance, sana from what I heard, pondo na lang talaga yung problema. Meron na silang na-compute na 520 million for 4 barangays in Aroroy, Masbate. Kung masimulan lang natin to sana even in small areas ay at makita na how it can makita yung potential kung paano makatulong sa may isda, then we can scale it up later. Ayun lang po for now. Maraming salamat po.
Thanks so much. No? So, ang dami nating dapat pag-usapan, but sa mga gustong magtanong, you can message, you can put in your questions dun sa comment section if you're watching on Facebook. And if you're here on Zoom, type your questions on the chat box. So, so far, here's a question from one of our participants. Anyone can answer. Is it necessary for these realignments to be included in the GAA? Can we just have more bayanihan laws next year as needed? So magpasa na lang daw ng bagong bayanihan kung whenever necessary. So who wants to answer that? Robert, can you take that?
Yeah. I think Sir Joshua answered this in the chat. Na parang he prefers that they be included in 2021 since these are things that the government should prioritize. And besides, DOF is hesitant about having additional stimulus packages. I share the same sentiment, mostly because una, hindi na po tayo gulat sa COVID-19. We've had 9 to 10 months to get to know this virus. We're still in an emergency, but it's an emergency that we already know. No, and it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. That's the point. It looks like we're going to carry it to 2021. So because of that, we believe there's little reason to exclude COVID-19 in the 2021 budget. Diba? By Bayanihan 2, Congress has shown that it can legislate items in response to COVID-19. Bayanihan 1, it just gave the president the power, emergency powers, kasi it needed the experts and technocrats to craft those items. By Bayanihan 2, Congress has shown that it knows the virus enough and its effects enough in order to respond to it. And we believe that already precludes the evasion na parang hindi na namin kayang sagutin yan. Kaya na lang sagutin. May Bayanihan 2 na And it doesn't pay to put this off because realignments like that are usually reserved for emergencies. They're quite disruptive to government implementation of programs. Diba? Yung in-expect mong budget biglang kukunin, mawawala. So hindi ko alam pag-scramble paano gagawin. So we try to avoid that as much as possible, especially since, again, we already know what the virus is. Not addressing COVID also feeds into the uncertainty and the ambiguity that we will feel next year. Parang we're walking into this blind. It's really the Congress's job to legislate according to the needs and priorities of the people, right? And it's quite clear now COVID is part of those priorities. So it shouldn't shirk from that and shouldn't defer that. And lastly, on a very practical point, 2021 is an election year. We think realistically, congressmen will spend more time with their constituents than in session with each other. So feel namin now is the time for them to focus and just really bear down. It's also to their benefit. Next year, they don't have to spend so much time in session anymore. Just, spend time with their constituents.
So may gusto pa magdagdag on the points? Okay. So sa mga participants, okay. Yes, sir.
Ralph, just to emphasize, the budget really looks like it was designed not to respond to any of our problems. That's the bottom line, no? At sasayangin natin yung pondo natin pagka hindi natin to realign.
Okay, so much of the budget mapupunta sa infrastructure, ang daming debates. I've spoken to several economists saying na meron namang ripple effect, multiplier effect, or lots of effects itong infrastructure. So anong rebuttal nyo doon sa mga ganong arguments? Ken, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to share to your first point about stimulus packages. I wanted to share one of the slides that we formed dito sa budget tracker, where we also study the bayanihan budget. So, yung nakita niyo po dito is the allotment releases of the Department of Budget and Management this year for Bayanihan 1 and 2. So, what we see is that there was a plus one dun sa point ni Robert na there really is a delay. So there was a 4-month delay between the expiration of Bayanihan 1 to the actual budget release in Bayanihan 2. So if we think that these Bayanihan parang new Bayanihan program realignments will happen in a manner that is responsive to people's needs immediately, likely not. That's what the evidence, that's what our experience this year said. So yun, just wanted to raise that point.
Thanks, Ken. So may add lang din, no, dun sa analysis din namin sa budget, no, merong in case magkaroon ng lockdowns ulit, social protection mukhang wala tayo, medyo mahirapan tayo maghanap ng pagkukunan. So I think dapat talagang naka-specify yung mga ganong bagay, like, di ba, Tanya?
Yes, and siguro emphasis na rin, no, nung paano ba magiging agaran talaga tong tulong na to, as demonstrated by Ken, and then nasabi na rin ni Ate Ana sa ground nga, naging talagang madugo at mabagal yung pagbibigay ng ayuda na to. So kung magkakaroon man tayo ng dagdag pang budget dito, isa rin kailangan bigyan ng pansin kung paano magiging mas mabilis pa itong pagbibigay ng mga ayuda na ito.
Okay, going back to my question earlier on infrastructure, anong main any rebuttals on those points na may ripple effect yung infrastructure projects, di ba? Parang when you build a bridge, for instance, or roads, you also stimulate the local economy around it, the small businesses around it. You encourage imports, exports, things like that. So ano ba? What's the score?
Hi, Ralph. Theoretically, tama yung sinabi mo. Theoretically, that is assuming that the location of this infrastructure projects ay doon talaga sa kung saan sila kailangan at talagang may maseserbisyohan na mga communities. Kaya lang alam naman natin na minsan nagsuserve yan sa interest ng iilan. Yun. Thank you.
So anyone else who wants to chime in?
Yeah, just 2 points, Ralph, if I may. No? Siyempre, yung unang argument, kasi actually si Luis na nagpaliwanag eh. Kay Luis ko nga na pick up ito last time na nag-webinar tayo. Yung multiplier effect ng construction sa infrastructure sa Pilipinas. Well, apparently sa teorya tama yun, pero sa pag in-apply mo sa Pilipinas, sa karanasan natin, mukhang hindi. So, hindi siya nag-i-induce ng mas maraming private sector investors. No? Pero yung pangalawa, na lumabas very recently sa mga hearings, hindi rin kayang i-absorb ng DPWH pala yung kanilang mga pondo. Bakit natin itataya lahat ng ating yung buong bet natin nandiyan? Hindi naman pala nila kayang gawin yan. So, ang argument natin, mas makakabuti at direct ang epekto kung i-shift natin yan doon sa priorities talaga ng sambayanan ngayon.
And may I add, right of way pa lang, medyo komplikadong issue na, di ba? So,
if I may add, Ralph, yung social
yeah.
implications ng, kasi syempre if you build new infrastructure, may displacement din yan kadalasan. So ano ba yung mga social safety nets at yung pagkonsulta sa mga tao at environment na rin na magiging impacted itong mga infrastructure?
Last point, sorry. Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ayun, well, yes, again, in theory, of course. But you see, slower implementation, mabagal yung, again, it can only absorb so much. We see this year na it really slowed down compared to last year, 16.5%. And ito laging binibring up ni JC sa mga tanungan na ganyan. Oh, they say there's a strong multiplier effect, about 8 or 9 times. Where's the study that shows that? Asan muna, ilabas nyo muna para we also convince the public. Kasi you're spending the public's money. So it's the public's right to be informed of the justification for spending it that way, not just some highfalutin economic theory. So yeah.
Okay, so we have a question here from, okay, Ken, go ahead. Last na.
So just on the infrastructure related item, we'd rather invest in infrastructure projects that can be implemented immediately. So tulad ng mga napakita na, pop-up bike lanes can be done like by volunteers nga from our bikers community. Super galing nila. I think they are democracy in action. And while there are siguro improvements to the current Senate version that's being debated, because Senator Grease increased the budget. Sa Congress, zero yung service contracting. Tapos halos zero rin yata yung active transport budget. Dinagdagan niya yung service contracting by 5 billion pesos, and then around 500 million yung active transport. But if we look at yung larger picture na ipinakita kanina ni Robert, diba, that's a drop in the bucket compared to, yun nga these are the initiatives that can be implemented immediately where there's growing LGU support. Why don't we invest more in these versus yung mga matatagal pang may implement?
Okay, so we have a question here from Anonymous. Okay. Pakilala naman kayo guys, yung mga gusto magtanong. So here's a question. According to DepEd, LGU's Special Education Fund or SEF may be tapped in funding distance learning. Would this be enough to fund the shortfall for distance learning budget? James, you want to take that?
Yep. Thank you, Ralph. Yes. With regard to that, definitely yung schools natin would surely appreciate any help na dadating sa kanila. But with regard to SEF, I think we should not heavily rely on it. Una, yung availability niya is contingent to an LGU's income level, no? And tsaka yung collection of real property tax in a given year. So lalo pa ngayon may pandemya, baka mas mababa yung turnout. I think one important point is yung LGU support to blended learning ay hindi limited to SEF. Kahit yung support to logistics, malaking bagay na yon para ma-unload yung mga teachers and parents natin in the delivery of modules. I think that that's it. Tapos if I may add, Ralph, dun sa unang question kanina about dun sa stimulus package, no? I think another consideration is yung urgency, no? Bakit pa tayo maghihintay next year or for another quarter when teachers and parents are actually soliciting right now for donations for printing? It should be now because the people need it now. Kailangan bigyan ng panahon yung pagbusisi ng budget kasi yung budget for next year is not your typical guy. This is the opportunity for the government to respond to the devastating effects of the pandemic in all sectors. And more importantly, it should be a people's budget. It should reflect the needs and situations of the people, especially the poor and the marginalized.
Okay, so I want to ask naman, marami kayong recommendations. We had lots of webinars already regarding trying to dissect the 2021 budget, kung saan kulang, saan dapat mag-allocate, things like that. Pero kumusta yung pag-assert ninyo ng mga changes? Any success, silver linings? I'm trying to stay positive because of all the negative, numbers are pretty bad right now, right? So I want to know kung may success story na ba kayong na lumusot na ganitong provision or ganitong pondo, things like that. Wala. Anyone can jump in.
Oh, meron naman, Ralph. So, I think the interesting thing that siguro mensahe rin natin sa lahat ng mga citizens na nanonood ay organizing can work. But it requires yung hard everyday conversations. The boring everyday conversations with everyone you can possibly talk to. So halimbawa, nung Bayanihan 2, anong inaaral namin kasi yung Bayanihan 1 budget sa budget tracker, parang biglang napasok kami dun sa transport budget mobilizations. So what that and nakita namin sa Bayanihan 1 na parang walang transport budget. So kailangan nating mag-mobilize para sa Bayanihan 2 meron. So ang pinropose namin ng 40 billion, we got 9.5 billion. Pero what it took to get to that point was kailangan makausap yung mga transport workers unions, kailangan makausap yung mga bikers, and then they should have the chance to be able to draft the policies that affect them. So feeling ko the counter to the authoritarianism that we see now is a continued conversation and organizing that where we assert our democratic right at the table. And then these people who are most affected by the policies should be able to draft them. So the unions should be able to draft the service contracts. But the bikers should be able to draft the ordinances that affect them. At ito, I think napapakita to nung organizing sa coalition din namin. Na parang buklod-buklod kami kasi we organize to survive in this time when may COVID at may climate crisis.
So Sir Joshua, how's your proposals for the labor sector naman? How's that moving along?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult, no? Ang nagiging linya, ang ruta na parang gusto nang gawin ng mga sumusuporta sa Senado ay i-insert na lang siya as a special provision where LGUs can draw from, no? And LGUs do the same, do the things that has to be done. No? Kasi nga, parang hesitant galawin yung napakalalaking mga chunks no? ng pondo natin nung supermajority na meron sa Senado ngayon. So, but we'll see. We'll keep trying.
For social protection naman, Tanya, Anna, any updates or can you just briefly reiterate the main points again that you want for the budget for next year?
Baka I'll ask Ate Ana to share, no? Kasi marami nang napanalo din yung grupo nila sa pakikipag-ugnayan din sa mga ahensya. Ate Ana?
Okay. Yun nga, nakakatuwa dahil nga sa organisado ang samahan at nakikita talaga na tinitindigan yung mga datos doon sa mga ginagawa namin. Nakita rin namin naman na malaking bagay talaga yung may pagkakaisa, no? At nakikita natin na justify yung ginagawa. Siguro yun sa budget na ito, yun nga lang, matyaga lang talaga sa patuloy natin pag-ano na hindi lang kasi sapat yung 2 billion na increase na ginawa, no? Base dun sa ating hinaharap. At yung sa pag-implementa, kailangan talaga makita natin na ito ay may konkretong paraan, yung assessment magiging maganda para mapakinabangan ng nangangailangan talaga. Kasi marami naman talaga pero alam ko naman talaga hindi kaya lahat mabigyan. Pero magkaganon man, maging positive, talagang sabayan rin talaga ng tiyaga, and then yung pagtulong-tulong natin talaga hindi mawawala yun doon sa ginagawa natin. Ayun po, ang samahan naman po ay patuloy na tumatayo, naninindigan at nagmamahal naman sa kapwa namin mahihirap kasi tayo na lang yung mag-aanuhan maghihil pataas, 'di ba? At syempre hindi naman din namin basta hihingi, magre-request, makikita naman natin na ito ay gagamitin sa tamang paraan at makakatulong talaga sa pagbangon muli. Yun po.
Okay, so we have another question naman. Yung tanong nito from another anonymous participant. Yung tanong niya ay tungkol sa mga task force. Yung mga task force for COVID is supposed to address faster budget disbursements for COVID relief. Do you agree, may insights ba kayo on this na napakarami nating mga task force. Yung ganitong strategy ba would make it faster for disbursements?
Ako, I think not necessarily. I think the main point of organizing a task force is so they become more coordinated to address a particular problem. The main point of that is not necessarily, diba? Parang organizing a task force does not automatically expand your agency's absorptive capacity. It doesn't automatically make you able to obligate and then disperse these things. At the very least, I think, yung aim lang ng task force is so that they're more coordinated and acting. And maybe an incidental benefit to that is budget. But I don't think we can really fault the organization of these task forces and then connect them to the slower disbursement. That disbursement problem has always been there, with or without COVID, through the regimes, through any administration. Hindi lang ito matter of leadership. This is an institutional problem. And no one really wants to work on the institutional problems because they're hard everyday work, they're technical work, they're not exciting or flashy. But as we see, in times of disaster, it's the institutions that remain standing, and it's the institutions that should be able to deliver. Kaya ganun. So I won't really, I won't really connect those two.
Okay, speaking of disasters, agri-environment, talagang ayaw pang tumigil ng 2020, and we're expecting. I mean, we on an average we have 5 to 6 typhoons naman talaga na tumatama na talagang malala for. I mean, 20 typhoons on average na tumatama, 5 or 6 talagang malala yung tama. Marita, comments on the budget for next year and the budget historically for these sectors, agri-environment, fisheries. May nagbabago ba? May wish list ka ba for this year and for next year and the coming years?
Yun nga, no, kaya ako nabanggit na for the environment, yung increased support sana for mangrove refo. Maganda naman ng budget allocation ng DNR sa forestry, pero sana mas malaki yung budget sa mangrove. Kasi even the environment, the other big environment NGOs, sabi nga nila na medyo minority yung mangrove ecosystem sa pag pinag-usapan yung forestry. Kung meron tayong tinatawag ng mga frontliners sa COVID, yung coastal communities, frontliners yan sa typhoons. Di ba sa dagat nang gagaling yung typhoons? At pagdating yan, pag sinabing landfall, saan yan nagla-landfall? Sa coastal communities. Kaya kailangan talaga na nakikita natin sumusobrang dalas ngayon, nag-increase na talaga dumadami ang increasing intensity of typhoons, kaya kailangan na talagang i-protect yung coastal ecosystem. Tapos nabanggit din kanina ni Robert yung tungkol sa mga yung sa mga task force, nasabi niya it's not necessarily bad. Naalala ko tuloy na nag-create ng task force on the after nung kay Rolly ba yun or kay Typhoon Ulysses, di ba? I was just wondering kasi nandiyan na nga yung NDRRMC. Baka kailangan lang palakasin yung NDRRMC. Pero siguro, okay. Pero tama rin nga na the task force are to improve coordination among agencies. Kasi yung mga agencies may tendency to work na parang nakakahon, di ba? So, sana ma-improve talaga yung coordination para for faster delivery of the services. Although I also agree it doesn't follow na there's also faster disbursement of funds. Yun. So yun ang mako-comment ko dyan.
So James, you have something to add on that? Disasters and wins in your sector?
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. Yung sa wins, no, isa yung sa bayan yan too, no, our group were able to add the provision authorizing the Department of Education in reallocating unused funds for hiring teachers and reproduction of modules. So that's with the help of ID and of course to Senator Drilon. And since then, the Department of Education and their schools were able to print almost 90% of the modules for the first quarter. With regard to use of disasters, I think dito papasok yung modality, which is yung modular learning, no? Kasi hindi naman lang basta pandemic yung sinusubukan nating i-address, but the overall problem of multiple forms of disruptions and pre-existing vulnerabilities experienced by learners. So it seems that yung paggamit ng modular modality is still the most accessible para sa lahat ng learners and then sensitive and responsive to the needs ng learners natin. So I think baka for future reforms, baka we can expand more on the options for flexible learning to make the basic education adapt to multiple forms of disasters.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. So final words. Who wants to start? Any just the main points that you want our viewers to know? I don't know. Message of hope or anything that the people should be more critical about. Wants to start? Joshua, sir?
Yeah, okay. A quick, 2 points. First, in response lang doon sa last question mo, no? Ang napapansin namin problema talaga, pagka-ideological yung problema no? Mukhang hindi naniniwala ang gobyerno na trabaho ng gobyerno mag-generate ng trabaho. No? Mukhang ang paniniwala ng ating mga economic mismanagers ay dapat ito ay iniiwan sa mga private sector, hindi nga mag-work yan sa panahon ng ganitong crisis. So, having said that, naniniwala pa rin kami na kung katulad na sinabi ni Ken, no, kung merong malakas na tulak ang mga tao, ang sambayanan para talaga kulitin ang ating mga kongresista at ang ating mga senador, no, na panahon na para i-shift ang budget para sa jobs generation, it can be done.
Ken?
Siguro, Ralph, like itong mini-mention, parang a call to empathy, both dahil 4.5 years din akong nasa gobyerno. So naiintindihan ko kung gaano kahirap mag-implement and I appreciate the magnitude of this once-in-a-century pandemic. But empathy goes both ways, diba? We understand that there are institutional issues, but I think government also has to understand that people who criticize are people who build the nation. Diba, ang panalangin nga namin para sa kanila ay Panginoon, para sa ating lahat, pero para sa kanila mas lalo. Panginoon, bigyan mo kami ng biyaya na naisin ang puna. But you have to desire critique in order for you to become more effective at your jobs. And it is in the boring everyday work where institutions are built. Magla-last word ako tungkol dun sa absorptive capacity kasi sa tingin ko mahalagang tingnan ng bawat isang civil society organization yung kapasidad ng ahensyang kasama sa pag-organize. So here are a few questions. So first is, sino ba yung appointed dun sa team? Diba? And the power of appointments is with the president or with the secretary. Diba? If hindi ginagawa ng appointee yung trabaho niya, kailangan ba siyang palitan? Ano bang kailangan suportahan? Ano bang kayang suporta yung pwedeng maibigay? May experience ba at nirespeto ba yung career staff? Diba? Yun kailangan tanungin. Yung third, sino ba yung nasa team? Are there enough people in the team? Kasi normally, parang abstract ng concept ng absorptive capacity, but sometimes it really is just walang tao dun sa team. And more often than not, that's what the issue is in government. And then, is there an organizational structure that allows these people who are good to do their jobs well? So, and dito I think yung role ng civil society to find those really good government employees, the hardworking government workers who are silent, and then support them. So, kailangan natin silang hanapin at supportahan. Marami namang magagaling kailangan lang nilang supportahan.
Thanks, Ken. James?
Yeah. Thank you, Ralph. No? So, next year kasi, nasabi na it's an election year. Baka focus na lahat for 2022. But I think ito yung best opportunity for the government, especially the Congress, to show the public that they do provide proper attention and respond to the concerns of the greater majority. The national budget is probably the clearest manifestation of the government's priority, and we still have the remainder of the year to prove that our priorities are well placed now, and that the government are keen to attending to people's needs. For EDUC, we should meet where teachers and learners are now. It's really not an issue of availability, but of priority. And so, as far with regard to education, and I think with other sectors as well, we should view this as an investment to human capital, investment to countries' long-term growth.
Okay, Miss Marita?
Two concerns for the year, ano. Una yung sa COVID. Tapos pangalawa, ito matagal naman na pero medyo strongly felt, especially this last quarter, yung mga natural disasters, mga climate-induced disasters. So I would really love to see improved budgeting for biodiversity. Hindi lang sa coastal area, from ridge to reef ito, from our watersheds down to the coastal communities. Sana makita na yung pangangailangan na protektahan talaga yung watershed to the coastal areas. Nakita naman yan sa flooding, nakikita na ang cause ng flooding ay yung pagkakalbo ng kagubatan. Sana magkaroon na talaga ng budget allocation for projects addressing these concerns. Tapos yung pangalawa naman, yung sa fishery livelihoods, yung support to improve the livelihoods of the fisher folk sector, with taking into consideration yung nangyari during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, so thanks so much, Miss Marita. Tanya?
Hello, ayan. So siguro yung point ko lang para sa atin ngayon, no, na bago rin dumating yung pandemya, alalahanin natin na talagang marami na yung mga problema na nararanasan ng mga tao na nasa vulnerable sector ay nandun na before pa. We are here, we are speaking in different sectors, pero patong-patong talaga at interconnected itong mga vulnerabilities na to. So huwag natin kalimutan na kabit-kabit rin yung mga pinaglalaban naming lahat at pinaninindigan naming lahat. So, kung walang gagalaw na isa, talagang hindi natin maaabot yung gusto nating magandang antas ng buhay para sa lahat. So, yun lang, yung perspective na yun. And then second, siguro yung iiwan ko rin na mensahe na mahirap talaga itong dinadanas natin ngayon. So, ito, message of hope, Ralph, na merong quick wins, pero tandaan na natin na nagkaroon na rin naman ng pandemya noon at naagapan yun. So mas maging long-term din siguro yung ating thinking kahit na immediate itong mga responses natin. The policies that we propose and yung mga ginagawa natin sa ngayon, sana nakaposition din siya sa paraan na we will be better prepared for another pandemic or another type of risk na mararanasan natin as a nation. So yun, yung pag-shift ng mindset din. Kasi na-mention ni James yung election, yung ganyan. Pero yun, sana mas maging bukas at mas maging malayo pa yung paghangad natin para sa ating bansa.
Miss Ana?
Hello. Bali, may iwan ko lang, no, dahil nga next year election time na rin yung mga campaign. Sana lang po yung sa ginagawa nating budget ay hindi yun magamit, no, masiguro na ito ay hindi magagamit sa maagang pangampanya ng mga LGU kasi parang ang mangyayari sila na naman baka ang mag-filter. Sana po hindi ganoon. Magbase po tayo sa talagang nangangailangan at sana laging pagkilos kasi hindi lang naman to ang ating kakaharapin. may bukas pa, marami pang darating. Ang pagiging positibo dapat lagi nilang sasamahan ng bilis kasi yun ang kailangan eh. Kailangan pagiging maaga para hindi lumaki yung problema. At siyempre, kailangan din po natin bilang kaming mamamayan, siyempre yung pakikiisa din na para tayo mismo nanggagaling sa atin na gusto natin itong may ayos, sana magkaroon tayo ng united tayo doon sa pag-unlad at ma-overcome natin itong lahat na ito. At siyempre, sa gobyerno, bago sila magbigay ng mga polisiya, siguro, gawin din nila, mag-groundwork talaga sila. Maranasan nila yung nararanasan ng iba, damhin nila para mas madali nilang masolusyonan yung mga problemang nagdadaan sa atin. Kaya mabagal kasi hindi nila ramdam yun eh. Yun po.
Thanks so much, Anna. And finally, Robert.
Okay. Well, budget work happens every year, and there's really no unimportant year. It just happens that this year, my God, di ba? Ayokong batiin kasi hindi pa tapos yung taon. Meron pa tayong 6 weeks, baka ano pa yung dumagdag na mangyari dyan. But that, I think, ano yun eh, there has to be a realization na itong mga pinag-uusapan nating figures, di ba? Sobrang nakakaduling minsan pag nakapresent. It affects lives, thousands of lives. It's rooted on needs. These things that we heard from our sectors, ano yan eh, bunga yan namang hinaing ng mga nangangailangan talaga. Hindi naman yan pampasikat lang or pampakyut scores in some scoreboard that doesn't exist. It's not eh. It's not something that can easily be dismissed. And as everyone pointed out earlier, this is the kind of work that is really unglamorous. But someone has to do it. I'd like to thank everyone who is here, especially our attendees, because the fact that you're here spending your time talking about the budget, that's already a performance of your civic duty, right? A lot of talk about elections, exercise your right, but it goes beyond that. We exercise it every day. And I think one of the most powerful ways we do that is holding our representatives to account. They're elected, they're powerful, but they're representatives nonetheless. So it's also part of our job to remind them of what we need and what we want. So hopefully, better terms of engagement amongst ourselves and with the private sector, with the government. End of the day, lahat naman tayo Pilipino. We just want a better life for everyone. So thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone, for doing the unglamorous and much needed work for this country. No, so. For those sa mga nanonood, we have lots of stories on Rappler regarding the budget and the socio-political dynamics and economic implications of it. Make sure to follow that. If you want to watch our previous webinars, please just head over to our Facebook group and search for the videos. And that's it for me. I'm Ralph Rivas, and on behalf of this panel, thanks so much for watching.